Morning again, everyone. I first want to take this time to thank Ken Hodges. He has really encouraged me in a lot of ways here to become more involved in the church. However, I would advise if you ever see him standing at a door to go the opposite way, even if it involves jumping out a window, because you will end up here, I promise you. No, but I do thank him because it has really helped me and encouraged me in my personal life as well. And in preparing for this sermon or testimony, I think the devil will try to use everything he can to distract us. And it happened, we saw when Allison was sharing her testimony. But last night about 3 o'clock, our youngest son, B, woke up and he said, "Daddy, I think I've got to throw up." I said, "Okay." So we went to the bathroom and he started throwing up, and he started throwing up every 15 minutes. And he had this horrible stomach bug, and Allison and I knew right away that the devil was trying to do everything he could to keep us from being here today and distracting us. But we had a prayer, and amazingly, he's here and he's doing much better. So there is definitely power in prayer, and when you commit to following Jesus, the devil is going to do everything he can to distract you from doing that. And very early in my life, I went through something very difficult, and it's something that I still struggle with today. My biological father was abusive to my mother and didn't really care that much for me either. I witnessed a lot when I was very young, and it's things that a child shouldn't witness or should never feel for that matter. I remember my mom and dad getting into a really bad fight one time, and I still can see my dad running out into the backyard, falling on his knees and crying. And I remember going to him and just begging him, saying, "Dad, please just go back in and love on Mom," because I thought that would make everything better. And I wanted our little family to be whole again, and I wanted him to love her and everything to be okay and to be normal with no fighting. But unfortunately, that was not the case. And there was another time that really sticks out to me that I remember. My mom and dad had gotten into a fight. I don't know what it was about, but I do remember my mom taking me back into my bedroom and locking the door and keeping my dad out. Well, the next thing I know, I was crying and very upset. And the next thing I know, my dad had kicked in the door to try to get to us. So he immediately came to me to try to hug me and comfort me. But instead, I ran after my mom, who had run out of the room and somewhere else in the house, because I wanted to make sure that she was okay. So after years of neglect and emotional abuse that my mom had gone through and I had gone through, they finally decided to get a divorce. And now I was supposed to split my time between my mom and dad, stay with my mom during the week, go with my dad on the weekends. And it was arranged for him to come by and pick me up every Friday afternoon so I could spend the weekend with him. And I remember countless times standing at the end of the driveway waiting for him to come and pick me up because I was so excited to see him after not seeing him all week. But more times than I care to remember, I was standing at the end of the driveway waiting, and he would never come. And when this would happen, I would always go back into the house, of course, crying and very upset. And my mom would always be there to comfort me and to love me. And I never remember her saying anything negative about my dad at the time, although she had plenty of reason to do so. And after the dust had settled from their divorce, my mom and I spent a number of years alone, and they were very calm, peaceful years because it was just the two of us. And no one else but just us. But at some point, my mom started dating someone else. And they dated for a number of years, and I began to like this new person in her life. Things got serious enough between the two of them that they decided to get married. I remember where I was exactly when my mom told me that she was engaged and going to be married again. I was at my grandparents' house, and I remember just pouring crying as soon as she told me and I didn't understand at the time why I was crying, but looking back on that and reflecting on that, I can see that there was some outsider trying to penetrate our inner circle, and I felt like that bond that we had formed through those years was going to be broken, and I certainly didn't want my mom to be hurt again, and I didn't want to be hurt again as well. But I found out things this time around would be different. This new person my mom had married was named Mike, and he was now my stepdad. As I said, I liked him when they were dating, but I was very cautious about opening my heart to him. and getting close to him and accepting him as my stepdad. Over time, I realized he was very different from my biological father. He really loved my mom, and he treated her with respect. He also loved me as if I were his son to begin with. It took a while, but I began to trust him more and more. I even started to accept him and love him. In fact, I decided to have him adopt me, and from that moment forward, I no longer called him Mike, I called him Dad. And isn't that exactly what Jesus does for us? He sees our broken lives, be it past or present, and accepts us right where we are. He loves us unconditionally. He will never leave you standing at the end of your driveway while you wait for him to pick you up. He is always there showing us an incomprehensible grace and love. My relationship with my stepfather was very similar to that type of relationship, in that I had never experienced that type of unconditional love other than from my mom. And I would experience that again later in life, as you'll soon find out. Now, I was not raised in a Christian home. However, I went to a Christian school. I was always exposed to Christianity, but I certainly never cared for it or understood it. In middle school, I would go to youth meetings every Wednesday night that the church would put on, and I would go to the Thursday morning church services that our school would put on. But that everything, the get-togethers on Wednesday night were more of a social event than anything. During the Wednesday night meeting and during the church service on Thursday mornings at school, they would always give those in attendance an opportunity to give their life to the Lord and become a Christian. There would always be someone who would go up in front of everyone, and they would be pouring crying after making this life-changing decision. Sometimes it appeared that I could see their rebirth or being reborn right in front of my eyes. I could never tell if the tears they had were real or if they were just caught up in the moment. It always felt like it was a show to me, never really authentic. But something must have gotten through to me during those meetings, because at some point during my high school years, I decided to give my life to the Lord and become a Christian. And I didn't do this in front of a large crowd like I'd seen so many others do. It was more of a private moment for me. I didn't experience any kind of rebirth. I didn't hear angels sing, and I certainly didn't feel any different. But I was wanting more. After some time had passed, I went to see the youth pastor at my school because I had some questions that were nagging me, and I wanted him to answer them for me. One of my main concerns was I remember telling him that I didn't feel like I was saved because my declaration for the Lord was not done in a more public manner. And that's what I had witnessed so long, and I thought that's the way it worked, and that's what you had to do. After I talked to him, I don't remember what he said. I know he didn't really provide me any comfort. And from that point on, things kind of went downhill for me spiritually and personally. I continued on through high school as any other kid did, but around 10th or 11th grade, I started making bad decisions. I began to drink here and there. Alcohol seemed to always be available at a friend's house or at parties I would go to. It started out relatively harmless, and I was cool when I was fitting in with a certain crowd. Even though I was at a Christian school, there were plenty of people that were bad influences on me, and it didn't take much to get me going in the wrong direction. I had easy access to, pretty soon I was drinking before school. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start my day off on a bad note. I had easy access to alcohol because it was always in my house. Little did I know that what started out as something that made me feel cool and like I fit in would become something very troublesome for me later in life. Now, not all things were negative in high school. In 11th grade, a new girl came to our school that I came to know as Allison. We dated in high school off and on, maybe more off than on. And when we were dating, I stayed away from my friends and drinking because I knew that was something that she didn't enjoy, and that's not something that she liked to do. At one point, we were getting very close in our relationship, and she decided to break up with me. And I didn't understand why, because I thought things were going really well. But I found out later that Allison's dad had encouraged her to break things off with me because he felt things were getting too serious for two high school students. Allison was a model student both academically and morally, and I think her dad viewed me as a distraction to her and not in a good way. Even though we broke up, she would never give up on me. But after we broke up, I began to slip into my old ways, drinking and making a lot of poor decisions. It was my senior year when I decided to spend a week at Myrtle Beach for spring break with some of my friends. For a week, we were alone at the beach and we felt like we owned the world. We would go to parties and drink and have the best time, or so I thought. And it was during this trip that I decided to do drugs for the first time, and it would not be the last. After spending a week at the beach, we made it back home with little incident. That would all change soon. We had been back from our trip and in school for a couple of weeks when the rumors of what took place during that spring break started to circulate around our little school. After one of my friends that was on the trip with us was questioned by the principal about what all had happened, the truth was now known. I was eventually called into the principal's office where I received my punishment, 10-day suspension. I really got off light considering a few of my friends could not walk during our graduation ceremony. During my 10-day suspension, I was to write a 10-page paper on alcoholism and reflect on my mistakes. Honestly, it felt more like a mini vacation than anything else. And after returning to school, the rest of my senior year went by pretty uneventfully. After high school, I went away to a school called Lee's McRae, which I think you all are familiar with here in Banner Elk. And during that time, Allison and I continued dating. I would drive home every weekend to go back to be with her and be close to her. We were growing closer and closer during this time. And I was not drinking now because I was totally committed to her and knew that if I did start back, it would ruin our relationship, and I did not want to do anything to hurt her or lose her. Several years went by, and we continued dating. She was continuing her path into the medical field to become a doctor, and was eventually accepted into the Bowman Gray School of Medicine, now known as Wake Forest University School of Medicine. And in her second year of medical school, we were married. During the first few years of our marriage, we became involved with a young adult class at the Kernersville Seventh-day Adventist Church. There were a number of people in that class that Allison had gone to school with, and she was still very close to them. We would get together every Friday night at someone's house where we would do a Bible study, and then after that was done, we would kind of hang out and just socialize with each other. And then the next day, we would have our own young adult Sabbath school class. Becoming more involved with this group of young adults was definitely a positive influence on my life. And we were involved with the young adult class for several years, but at some point we started becoming less and less involved. Allison was now in her first or second year of residency, and as she shared with you before in her testimony, she began to slide further and further away from the church and from her relationship with Jesus. And as the supposed spiritual leader of the home, I in no way encouraged us to remain involved in church. And our relationship with God and church we love so much became less important. As the years went by, we grew further and further apart from the church, and any resemblance of a relationship with God was gone. From high school to later in my life, there seems to have always been some form of addiction that has tried and been very successful at destroying my relationship with God and Allison. It seems there have always been potholes in my path to a relationship with God. One of the addictions that finally broke me was my alcoholism. This was something that I have battled with off and on since high school. About 5 years ago, I started drinking again. It started out as a drink here and there when we would go out to eat, and then it became a full-blown problem. I started drinking every night of the week. When our boys were little, we had a routine where Allison would lay down in the bed with Michael until he fell asleep, and I would lay down in the bed with B until he fell asleep. I'll never forget that one night after the kids went to bed, Allison was woken up by B coming into Michael's room, and he was so upset because he couldn't find me. So Allison started looking all over the house for me, and she couldn't find me either. She walked through the house, and she noticed that our garage door from the kitchen going out into the garage was open, but I was not out in the garage. At this point, she was getting scared and decided to call 911. And as she was on the phone with a 911 operator, she finally found me upstairs standing in the dark. When she came up to me, it was like I was asleep just standing there. As usual, I had been drinking after I put B to sleep. To this day, I have no idea why I opened the garage door or why I was standing upstairs or how I even got there for that matter. The next day, we had a very long discussion about how drinking was becoming a problem and that it had to stop. And it didn't take much for me to stop because I was pretty shaken up by the previous night's events. As I said, I have no idea why or how I ended up upstairs, but looking back on that moment, I truly feel that God was using that moment to get my attention. It worked, but unfortunately, it was very short-lived. After a couple of short weeks of not drinking, I started again, and this time it seemed to intensify. And I thought to myself, why in the world would I start this up again after the problems that I'd had from that before? Now, I kept drinking for a couple more uneventful months, and just like in high school, I was having the best time. I was living a fun life and enjoying it, or so I thought. I wish someone would have told me at that time that my future was far worth more than any temporary pleasure that I was experiencing. There would be another event that occurred that would shake me to the core. I'd been drinking and was drunk and made a decision that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Now, this time I have no doubt that God was getting my attention and saying, enough of this. You are my son. I love you, and please stop hurting yourself like this. Now, all throughout my life, when something bad would happen to me or anyone else, I would always blame God. How can God allow this to happen to his children, his creation? But this time it was different because I was broken. There was only one place for me to go after this, and it was at the feet of Jesus. And in doing so, I realized that this painful thing was allowed to happen in my life because it had to. If not, I would have continued on the same destructive path. It's like with our children when they misbehave. At first, we give them a slight warning, and then it moves to a stiffer punishment if they don't listen. But it's out of love because we know and want what's best for them. And it's the same way with God. In Hebrews chapter 12, verse 11, it says, no discipline seems enjoyable at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it yields the fruit of peace and righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Have you ever been at the point in your life when you're so broken that everything is stripped away from you? And by that, I mean there's no facade, there's no feeling of that I've got everything under control. It's nothing but you and God, and there's nothing there to interfere with that line of communication between you and him. That's where I was. All the happy feelings from drinking were gone. All the feeling that nothing can happen to me was gone. I have to say that in that moment in my life, despite all the pain, it was a time when I felt the closest I ever have to God. In fact, I read something recently that said, much of the grace we experience from God happens in the context of suffering. I think it would be very insincere for me to stand up here and say, hey, you know that painful thing you're going through right now? Well, isn't it such a beautiful thing? Don't you just feel so close to God right now? It would not only be insincere, but insulting and hurtful. You may not feel a closeness to God at the moment, and it may be years later before you recognize the point of any suffering you went through. We may never know why we experience some of the pain that we have until we get to heaven. However, for me, at this particular moment in my life and the events that I had gone through, I experienced God's grace and that closeness to him immediately. It took a couple of years after all of this before we started going to church again. Prior to that, and as Allison had shared with you during her testimony, she was starting to face some difficult times herself. So her struggles and my struggles coincided with each other. And as I said, we started going to church again. And as they say, the rest is history. I recently read a book called Not a Fan by Kyle Idleman. Allison had been encouraging me to read this book, and I finally did. It's a very powerful book, and I would encourage all of you to read it as well. There are many things that I could point out in that book that are very, very good, but there's one analogy that he used at the end of the book that really spoke to me. Kyle uses the analogy of a check engine light blinking to be compared to the call of God. He said he had an old car that the check engine light came on one day and it kept blinking. Well, at the time, he didn't have the money to fix the car, so he took a black piece of electrical tape and put it over the check engine light. The problem solved, right? No, it worked for a while, but then one day, the car decided to not go anymore and it died. While reading this book, I began to reflect on the trials in my life, and in particular when I was drinking. I realized that during that time, God was calling me, and the little things that were happening in my life at that time were letting me know that my check engine light was coming on, or should I say, my check heart light was coming on. Just like Kyle did with his car, I put a piece of tape on my life and kept on going. However, as a French poet once put it, a person often meets his destiny on the road he took to avoid it. And I'm finding that to be very true in my life now. Now, my story is not special, and it's no different from what a lot of other people are going through right now. However, I recognize God's grace in that I'm one of His children, and His grace and love are bigger than any addiction I may have. I see a lot of people that are hurting and are filling their lives with meaningless things or doing things that show disrespect to themselves. It's so sad to see the hurt people are going through, knowing that Jesus loves them so much. So many people throwing their lives away and on the same destructive path I was on. We are God's children, and it breaks His heart to see us suffering the way we do. I understand this now more than ever being a father. As our Heavenly Father, Jesus wants nothing but the best for us, and He loves us in an immeasurable way. The only thing I can equate to this type of love is the love that I have for my boys. God loves us just because of who we are, not because of what we do, not because we've got it all together, and not because of our efforts or our lack of effort. In fact, there's nothing that we can do to make God love us anymore, and there's nothing that we can do to make God love us any less. And that's exactly how I feel about my boys. While I was preparing for this testimony, there was a story that was in the news for a couple of weeks. Some of you may have heard of it. It was in regards to a former NFL player who had committed suicide. He was in jail and serving a life sentence for murder. He was recently found in his jail cell hanged. All I could think about was how in the world could something like this happen to someone who seemingly had it all? His name was Aaron Hernandez, and he was drafted in 2010 by the New England Patriots. He was a highly touted recruit out of the University of Florida. At that time, he was one of the top tight ends in the league, and after 2 years of playing for the Patriots, he signed a 5-year contract extension worth $40 million. It appeared that everything was going his way. He was one of the best tight ends in the league, and he had just signed a huge contract extension. However, in 2013, he was indicted for murder. As he was being tried for that murder, he was indicted for 2 other murders that had occurred in 2012, which he was found not guilty of a few days prior to his death. When he was found in his jail cell, he had a Bible verse written on his forehead. It was John 3:16. I'm sure being a professional athlete, he had seen that verse on a sign at any game he may have played in before, and we're all familiar with that verse as well. But as I thought about that, I wondered, what did that verse mean to him in his final days? Was he aware of this before, or was he spending his time in jail searching through God's Word? Despite all the money and the fame that he had, maybe he was discovering that those things do not bring happiness, and that the only true happiness can be found in a relationship with Jesus. We'll never know, but it makes me wonder. There are so many people that seem to have it all, and we're probably envious of them at times. We think, if I just had more money, if I was just a little thinner, or whatever it may be, we would be so much happier and less stressed. People work so hard to make money, and they sacrifice so much to attain something that brings only temporary happiness. I did the same thing for years. Even though I was not out to make all the money I could, my addictions were doing the same thing by trying to fill a void in my life. It took a lot of years and heartbreak to come to the realization that Jesus is the only thing that can fill that void. Money or material things can never buy the happiness and peace that comes with knowing Jesus as your friend. As I said earlier, I would experience a grace like God offers later in my life, and that came in the form of my wife, Allison. I've given her countless reasons to give up on this relationship. The emotional pain that I've put her through over the years is beyond forgivable in human terms. But somehow she has shown me grace beyond anything I've deserved from her. I read something the other day that said grace can be defined as a love that stoops and rescues. That is exactly what Allison has done for me over the years, and I still cannot understand why. I do know beyond a shadow of a doubt that I would have taken a different path in my life had it not been for her. She's been such a strong positive influence throughout my life, and I absolutely love her for that. And I think her conviction for that was her encouragement from her grandmother, which many of you knew, um, had told her long ago to marry that boy because he was he was good. Although it's taken nearly 20 some years to maybe finally get to that point, but I think that was one of the main reasons why. So many people travel to other countries to go on mission trips, which there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. However, I think our mission field may be a lot closer to home than we think. In fact, I think some of the greatest mission work we can do is within our own families. I know that that has been the case with me. God has placed Allison in my life for a purpose, and then I feel like I've been her mission field throughout the years. And believe me, sometimes it can be a lot scarier and more emotionally trying than going off to some faraway country. So here I am now in front of the church sharing my testimony. Several years ago, this would have been the farthest thing from my mind, and church was the last place I wanted to be. When Ken first asked me if I would be interested in sharing my testimony, I was planning on saying no way, it ain't going to happen. However, for some reason, I held off a few days in getting back with him and giving him an answer. God had a plan during those few days. He kept whispering to me that I should do this, and no matter how hard I would try to ignore his encouragement, that feeling that I should do this would never go away. Jeremiah 1:4-10 really sums up my feeling on what I experienced during those few days before getting back with Ken, and I'd like to share those verses with you. The Lord said to me, I knew you before you were formed within your mother's womb. Before you were born, I sanctified you and appointed you as a spokesman to the world. Oh Lord, I said, I can't do that. I'm only a youth. Don't say that, he replied, for you go wherever I send you and speak whatever I tell you. And don't be afraid of the people, for I, the Lord, will be with you and see you through. Then he touched my mouth and said, See, I have put the words in your mouth. Today your work begins to warn the nations and kingdoms of the world. In accord with my words spoken through your mouth, I will tear down some and destroy them, and plant others, nurture them, and make them strong and great. Now, I don't expect anything I'm saying today to tear down any nations, but I do feel that God has placed me here for a reason, and he has given me the words to say. Yes, I'm broken. Yes, I have a past that I'm not proud of. I will still continue to struggle with things. And I know that the devil is putting in overtime with me because he knows the damage someone can do when they're committed to following Christ. But that's okay because God's grace is bigger than anything we can imagine and strong enough to transform our broken lives. If God can take a murderer named Moses, a despised tax collector named Matthew, a religious bigot named Saul, and a murdering adulterer named David to do his work and spread his word, he can do the same for me. He can do it for you too. Don't wait for that moment when you think you're good enough or when you think you're following all the right rules, because it's not going to happen before you turn over your life to Jesus. Besides, he doesn't want to wait for you to do that. He wants you now, regardless of your past or of your current situation. Thank you. Dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you so much for this day. Again, thank you for the opportunity that we can gather here and worship in your house. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my story and just encourage others to know that your grace is bigger than anything that they're going through right now, and that they give their lives over to you, that you can handle anything they throw your way. And we thank you so much for that, Lord. Amen.